Welcome. Since we are celebrating the 4th of July, I thought it would be fitting to look at a vital underpinning of our freedom, that is, economic freedom. And who better to talk about economic freedom is Dr. Timothy Roth, professor and chair of the Department of Economics for UTEP. Welcome, Dr. Roth.
Thank you, Holly.
Yeah.
Pleased to be here.
Good. Well, it's good to have you back. And I'll just open with a basic question. How economically free are we as a country right now?
Well, the straightforward answer is that everything is relative, but without question, economic freedom, broadly defined, is systematically eroding. Mm-hmm. And it has a great deal to do with the federal government and to a lesser extent what the state governments do. Mm-hmm. But I should caution that the meaning of economic freedom mm-hmm. is not something that's easily determined in a short conversation. Mm-hmm. The point being that someone can assert a right to sell marijuana. Mm-hmm. That can be interpreted to be an economic freedom. From my perspective, you don't have a right to do that.
Right.
And so ultimately society has to have something to say about that. And certainly in our system, society must have something to say about it.
Yeah, that is always the interesting issue, isn't it? Balancing the moral issues with the economic issues and the freedom issues. I don't know. How do you think the founding fathers intended for that to happen in this country?
Well, let me, if I may, sort of bifurcate, separate two things. Number one, in my view at least, it's not possible to separate so-called economic issues from moral issues. Most of my economist friends have been trained differently, and I respect that, but I think they're wrong. The point is, anytime you talk about economic freedom, it necessarily, and particularly attenuations of that freedom, that implicates a series of things, one of which is what are the goals, mm-hmm. what are the procedures that are going to be employed, and what are the implications for rights. Mm-hmm. And the moment you begin talking about goals and procedures and rights, that implicates morality, and that in turn implicates politics, because those are inexorably intertwined. And my basic point is we make a mistake if we put economic freedoms over here and so-called political freedoms and so on over there. Mm-hmm. And then to get to the second point or question, mm-hmm. America's founders kept it really simple. I can't prove it. I can't ask Thomas Jefferson or James Wilson to walk in here, but I'm confident, having read them and written about them, that they would virtually to a person say, you cannot separate economic from moral questions and moral questions from political questions, and they are therefore all related. And they would say, ultimately, that it's the states, the several states, now 50 states, mm-hmm. that are ultimately responsible for the welfare, the safety, and the morals of their citizens mm-hmm. under what is called their police powers. It's the states that are responsible for that. And so a lot of what, this is a separate question, but a lot of what the federal government does under the rubric of attenuating economic rights and therefore implicating morals and political questions isn't even their purview. And they're in the business constantly mm-hmm. of messing with our economic rights, mm-hmm. broadly defined. The
mm-hmm.
federal government, I mean.
So what would be the best example of, or most recent example of messing with our economic rights?
Well, I can't resist saying that the Affordable Health Care Act is probably the best current example. Mm-hmm. And let me sort of lay the predicate for this. I'll give everyone on the other side the benefit of the doubt. That is, I'll assume that it's well-intentioned. Let's provide universal health care to people. But the truth of the matter is that the way in which the law was passed violates all sorts of constitutional and other precepts. In fact, the whole process was, at least in my view, immoral. Because there was virtually no public participation, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the other thing I will say is that we'll get to this, I suspect, in a different question. You can account for many attenuations of economic freedom by asking the question, who demands this? Who wants it? And in the case of Obamacare, read today's Wall Street Journal, for example. Big Pharma, the pharmaceutical companies, pumped millions of dollars into that effort and essentially rolled over and allowed the process to proceed on the presumption that they were going to be beneficiaries. So that too, and I don't say that they should be disenfranchised, but it's a perfect example of how attenuations of freedom occur because of special interests.
Right. Well, and then you have how many states that are suing in a lawsuit against Obama?
26 states, and I'm proud to say that I signed an amicus brief in support of those 26 states before a circuit court and also before the Supreme Court.
So this is not to segue into this or sidetrack into this, but it is pretty unprecedented to actually have so many lawsuits against the federal government from the states about the whole issue of state versus federal
Without question.
rights.
And let me add, maybe gratuitously, I don't mean it that way, Obamacare's implications are massive, and one of the implications turned out to be, from the point of view of the Obama administration, the attenuation of the free exercise of religion clause. We know what's been unfolding there, and no need to reprise it right now. I would imagine that Big Pharma had no idea that that was going to be implicated, but the point is, it's an illustration of how an attenuation of an economic right, that is to say, who at the federal level can tell us that we must buy insurance?
Right.
Answer, they can't do it constitutionally, in my view. But then there's a corollary question. How can the federal government tell practitioners of a particular religion that they must set aside their views in the interest of an economic regulation? And to put it very bluntly, I don't think the administration understood what they were doing, and now they have unleashed the furies.
Pandora's box there, yeah.
The furies.
Yeah, definitely. One of the biggest arguments that I hear, and I don't know whether you hear this as well, for federal government involvement, for health care, for welfare, all types of programs, Social Security, is that somebody has to protect the underprivileged, the disenfranchised. Is that what a top-heavy federal government system does best, or is that true, or how do you counter that?
May I approach it this way?
Sure.
I respect the Constitution.
Right.
The founders had in mind a federal system, and I sort of laid the predicate for this a few moments ago. If you read James Wilson, you read James Madison, the two people primarily responsible for the writing of the Constitution. Wilson, the person who wrote the necessary and proper clause. You will discover that under the enumerated powers of the federal government, you have well-defined responsibilities. None of them reach the kind of question that you're talking about. That is to say, let me phrase it this way, assistance to the needy. That's the state's responsibilities. And I will say candidly that if the state of Texas were to tomorrow say, we want to institutionalize a universal health care system because certain of our citizens do not have health care, I would endorse the concept. I do not endorse it at the federal level. Social Security, as far as I'm concerned, and this means I can never run for public office, Social Security violated the Commerce Clause. Medicare violated the Commerce Clause. Those are all well-intentioned things, but they are the purview of the states, not the federal government. And I'll add this. I spent a good part of my life working in Washington. It's fashionable these days to talk about people who are remote from the people. I will suggest to you that after a person has served for a certain period of time in Washington, a member of Congress, a member of the Senate, the President, they automatically become remote. It's at the states where the people are, the elected officials are sensitive, and sensitive in particular, by the way, to the needy. Doesn't happen at the federal level. I can assure you of that.
So it's just becomes this rarefied atmosphere where they're inaccessible and they get caught up in
I'll put
their
it very simply. At the state level, at the local level, the needy are your neighbors. And if you don't feel sympathy, then there must be, in my view, something wrong with you. The elected representatives in a state environment are closer to those needy persons. Right. At the federal level, it's very simple. They don't vote, we don't care. Crudely put, that's it.
And so it really is a dynamic that the Founding Fathers had a very profound understanding of in the way that they set up the whole system.
Precisely.
Yeah.
I'll just interject this, if I may. The Founders' self-governing republic project was informed by one prior ethical commitment, and that was the idea of the moral equivalence of persons. And so, for example, they rejected the idea of subsidies to targeted industries. They would have gone berserk at the idea of targeted tax benefits that benefit the Gallo family and not, somebody much lower level of income. They would have rejected all of that out of hand. But most importantly, they believed that the nexus of power is the people, and the government that is closest to the people is the one that will have the most responsibility. I hope I'm making sense.
Oh yeah, you're making complete sense. One of the things that I've heard a lot lately from young people, actually some coming out of UTEP, they haven't taken your class yet obviously, is that really a kind of socialism married to capitalism is the best approach. It's the most compassionate. Could you just sort of quickly enumerate the difference between communism, socialism, capitalism, free market approaches?
Well, as I said earlier, some of these concepts are difficult to articulate in the irreducible minimum number of seconds.
Right.
Let me frame it this way. The popular conception of capitalism is that it really involves the exercise of individual decision units directing resources, their own and others, in the interest of the maximization of their own well-being or profit or whatever, constrained by the rules of the game. That is to say, constitutional constraints and regulatory and other constraints. The socialist enterprise is a little bit different, and I will start off this way. I'm going to share my views for what they're worth. No socialist enterprise has ever been undertaken without some significant utopian component. It always starts off with the idea that people are perfectible. But when the socialist says the productive resources must be owned not, as in a capitalist system, by shareholders, et cetera, but by the people, what that ultimately means is it will morph, and the ownership may nominally be in the hands of the people, but an elite will evolve, and the elite will direct the resources, and the elite will determine who shall get what. And that takes me next to communism. The fundamental difference between communism and socialism is that communists are very clear about the idea that not only do they want the proletariat, which has some interesting connotations, to own everything. They want the state ultimately to go away. And those concepts are irreconcilable. First of all, I don't know what the proletariat is, and I certainly don't believe the state will ever go away, and certainly in every communist country that has ever existed, the elite that I was talking about in the socialist context comes forward very strongly in the communist, and to a certain extent in the socialist regimes, and that has very important implications because they are intolerant of other informal and formal institutions like churches because they represent a threat. So the bottom line is, in my opinion, all sorts of good intentions. And when I was 20 years old, I thought the socialist enterprise sounded really good. Of course, it reminds me of Disraeli, who said, if you're 20 and if you're not liberal, you don't have a heart. And if you're 40 and you're not a conservative, you don't have a brain. The basic idea is utopian stuff, but it morphs. Look at Venezuela.
I was going to say, yeah.
Would anyone want to live in Venezuela?
Mm-hmm. So what is Venezuela? Socialist, communist, what is it?
I guess you'd have to ask their jefe, you know?
Mm-hmm.
But he would say socialist. But increasingly, I think he would be inclined to say communist. Look at Fidel Castro and his brother Raul, right? How well off are those people? What kind of freedom do they have? It's all about encouraging dependence. That, by the way, is an important issue which we don't have time to discuss. But always and everywhere, communist and socialist enterprises want to encourage dependence so that the people become quiescent and they take what is given to them. That's not Christian, by the way. It's not even moral in the broader sense.
So who are good, which countries are good examples of socialism? How about, is Canada, Great Britain, are they socialist or quasi-socialist? What are they?
I think the prudent thing to do is to identify countries that characterize themselves that way rather than to identify them, because inevitably they would object.
Right.
But I think you can make a powerful case that Greece is, for example.
Yeah.
Obviously, many of the former Eastern European countries, well, they're still Eastern European countries, but they're former members of the Soviet bloc. Those were all socialist. I've given the example of Venezuela, Cambodia, Vietnam. But the interesting thing is, consider the history of the late 20th century, with the exception of outliers like Venezuela, and that will change when he dies. Those Eastern European countries rushed to adapt the institutions of capitalism. So did Russia until Vladimir Putin came along. So, by the way, is Vietnam. So is Cambodia, Myanmar. They're all beginning to understand the benefits of capitalism.
Right, yeah. If you look at the whole United States, I mean, it seems like maybe communists tend to move towards socialism, capitalism, but it seems like we are moving more toward the socialism, central control sort of thing. How does this affect our economic freedom? We're talking about the 4th of July and freedoms here. What is it? Maybe we're the boiling frogs. Maybe we don't realize how much freedom we've lost.
I think it's very simple. Given our time constraint, let me frame it this way. Back in 1905, there's a famous Supreme Court decision called Lochner, in which the Supreme Court said that the state of New York did not have the right to pass a law that prevented people from working overtime in a bakery. New York did it because they were concerned, presumably, about the health and welfare of those citizens. The Supreme Court said, no, you violated the contract rights of the employees and the owner of the bakery. That single decision ignited a firestorm. Rejection of the whole idea of economic rights, like contract rights. Along came the 1930s and the eruption of Supreme Court decisions like Wickard-Filburn that institutionalized federal power in all areas. Wickard v. Filburn is a perfect example. A farmer was told he could not grow corn for his own use beyond some level approved by the federal government, even though it was not going to necessarily enter interstate commerce, but because it might enter interstate commerce. Now that's ridiculous.
Yeah.
And it opened the gates. Now, that's one thing. Torrent of regulatory impulses and new federal initiatives as a result of violations of the Commerce Clause. But then there's the necessary and proper clause. I'll get to the point in just a second. Necessary and proper clause, well, let me skip that to save time. Let me talk about the non-delegation clause. The non-delegation clause. Congress cannot, under the Constitution, delegate legislative powers to the executive. But it has done it year over year over year, and as a result we have the executive under many presidents interpreting the law to mean that they can do anything they wish, even though you find nothing in the enabling legislation that says that they can do it. So, for example, Texas knows about this. Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act. The executive is interpreting those acts as though they can do anything they want. Tell Texas you cannot do this, you must do that, and so on and so forth. Tell the other states. Here's my point, finally. You are right. There has been, after 1905, and beginning very intensively after the 1930s, a systematic erosion of our economic and therefore political rights and our moral status. There's only one way to resolve the problem, and that is for us to rise up and say to the Congress, primarily, what are you doing? You're allowing the executive to do this? Exercise your oversight responsibilities, because we're paying attention, and we did it to you in 2010, we're going to do it again.
Mm-hmm. So if you look at the period where there was the greatest erosion of these rights, what period of time would you say that was?
After roughly 1934, 1935.
Was that would be FDR? Or?
Yes.
And was he the one who just really tipped the scale in terms of
he
that?
was, except that I can't prove this, but I've written about it. The Supreme Court was scared of Roosevelt because he threatened to pack the court to start with. And by the way, the only reason he didn't get to pack the court was because the Democrats in the Congress rose up. The Democrats rose up and said, wait a minute, we have a Constitution. But the point is, Supreme Court paid attention to all of this, and the public rose up, and the public wanted a lot of stuff. They wanted Social Security, right? Eventually they wanted Medicare, they wanted Medicaid. Well, all right. Supreme Court got diminished. It got brutalized. And by the way, a little sidebar, this administration is trying to do it to the Supreme Court again.
Interesting.
But they're not going to prevail this time. This administration will not.
Because?
Because Obamacare will go down, at least the mandate will, I believe, because at least 5 members of the Supreme Court will stand up. But the reason they will stand up is because they understand the public's on their side and the president is out there.
So
it's public.
Yeah, so the Supreme Court is influenced by public opinion.
Of course it is.
Yeah.
Of course it is.
Right.
And that's not necessarily an indictment of them.
But
right?
it is a reality.
I mean,
yeah.
I can think of it this way. If I had been a member of the Supreme Court in the 1930s, I'd like to believe I would have said, go away, President Roosevelt. This is unconstitutional. We will fight this. On the other hand, if you thought you didn't have the public behind you, you might try to protect the institution as best you can so that he does not pack it.
Right.
And so you have something like the Supreme Court that you entered the 30s with, you know?
Sure.
So there are good motives and bad motives.
It's not that simple always. Just one last question, and that is, isn't the Book of Acts in the Bible, and it portrays something that looks an awful lot like socialism. So is Christianity really socialism?
My answer to it is this. I do not presume to look into the Savior's mind. Give me a break. However, what is clear is that he was fully committed to the idea of the moral equivalence of persons. And that has certain corollaries. If you accept that as an individual, then you automatically have certain responsibilities. With rights come responsibilities, and one of them is to care for your fellow citizens, if you wish to think of it that way. I know of no more effective way to derail that understanding of things than to institutionalize a socialist or a communist system where there is no respect for the moral equivalence of persons. It is ruling elites that drive everything. This I know from the sweep of history.
So the difference between the Book of Acts, where everyone had everything in common, and a socialist regime is that it was a voluntary endeavor instituted by the moral need recognized by all the individuals involved, not a legislative body imposing this system.
That's a perfect distillation of what I was trying to say.
Mm-hmm.
I don't trust socialists. I don't trust communists. I understand their motives most of the time, and it has very little to do with caring for their fellow human beings.
So you're just working on a new book, right?
Yes, I am.
And what's that about?
Well, the newest book is called Economists and the State, What Went Wrong. And in view of the time we have, I'll simply say that I'm arguing, among other things, that the moral foundation of the body of received economic theory is informed by utilitarianism, and there are massive problems with that understanding of the world. So that, for example, when the economist says, okay, a policy ought to be weighed based upon the consideration of the benefits and the costs, I say, whose benefits, whose costs, and how exhaustive are they? And in any case, what's really important is you can't get to questions like the moral equivalence of persons, because it's a completely impersonal enterprise. And so if you can't get to that, you can't address questions of rights, you can't address questions of justice, and so economists are lost.
So what would be an example of that? We have 1 minute.
Well, okay, somebody says there are benefits that accrue to halting drilling, and those benefits exceed the costs. Well, I can calculate the benefits and the costs in a narrow way, thinking about all of that, but typically those calculations do not take account of the effect on people's lives, the immediately affected people. And there's nothing in the theory that says, well, all right, then those people who are suddenly find themselves unemployed ought to be compensated in some way. The theory doesn't get to that, and that's an illustration of what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Okay, good. Well, Dr. Roth, as usual, we're out of time, but you're not out of things to say, so hopefully we'll have you back again.
Be happy to do it. Appreciate the opportunity.
Great. As always, I do wish that we had more time with Dr. Roth, but we are left with much to ponder. So what do you think about the whole issue of economic freedom and the 4th of July and our independence? Thank you so much for watching.